Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, and you are listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. I am thrilled to announce to you today that through the generosity of many, we have exceeded our year-end giving campaign goal of $900,000. As of today, we've received just over $968,000. This is praiseworthy, my friends, and it is vital to the ongoing ministries of your CMDA. I think it's a fantastic way for us to start the new year, and it makes me want to shout with King David in Psalm 111, "Praise the Lord. I will thank the Lord with all my heart as I meet," and I put that in quotes because we're on audio with you folks, "meet with his godly people like you, our listeners." Your generosity, it continues to inspire and encourage me. And so many of our staff and volunteers are also encouraged as they work tirelessly to educate, encourage, and equip Christian healthcare professionals to glorify our God. Your donations, whether they were big or small, they are significant to advancing the gospel of Christ here on earth through the ministries of your CMDA. Partnering together, we, the largest community of Christian healthcare professionals in the world, we are bringing the hope and healing of Christ to our world. All praise and honor be to the Lord for His tremendous provision as we finish 2023. Well, because of your continued support of CMDA, we can continue providing this weekly podcast to educate, encourage, and equip you on the important topics facing healthcare professionals in today's culture. As it has been for the last several years, the transgender topic remains at the top of the list, and we get more inquiries and questions on this topic than any other topic. So on this week's episode, Dr. Jeff Barrows and I have a discussion with Dr. Jeff Hansen. He's a pediatric and adolescent clinical psychologist. He recently released a book entitled The Transgender Dilemma in the Young. And it speaks into this transgender topic in a clear and concise way. So he joined us to share more about this new resource he's created. I'm so pleased that highly experienced as well as caring mental health professionals like Jeff Hansen are willing to speak truth without condemnation on these pervasive issues of our day, like gender identity. Well, let's jump right into our conversation with Dr. Hansen. Well, today on CMDA Matters, it is a delight to welcome to the program clinical psychologist Dr. Jeff Hansen, who got his training at the University of California, Berkeley, and then went on to get master's and PhDs at the University of Arkansas. And if you want to see his full bio, you can go to our show notes today. But Dr. Hansen's distinctiveness, and the reason we've invited him here today is he's released a new book entitled Transgender Dilemma in the Young. Jeff has been seeing patients with gender dysphoria and other issues in kids and adolescents for many, many years. And so when I heard about your book, I thought we need to get Dr. Hansen on the program. And Dr. Jeff Barrows is with me this morning, and we welcome you to the program today, Dr. Hansen.
Thank you, gentlemen, for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Well, Dr. Andre Van Mal, he actually reviewed 4 books recently that have just come out on the issue of gender dysphoria and the transgender tsunami. And he felt that the strength of this book, Dr. Hansen, was an amazing amount of material in a relatively light, literally a light book. It's only 80 pages long, and it's for parents, Dr. Barrows, and you had a chance to review Dr. Hansen's book, and I think it's packed, isn't it?
It is. It's a great reference. I'm going to make use of it in the future, I know, because in a very few number of pages, he's got a great number of references and summarizes the whole issue very well.
Well, Dr. Hansen, there's very few Christian professionals out there like yourself that are actively caring for these kids, and I think maybe that's something that's lost for those of us who have a Christian worldview and believe the Bible is true is that we lose out on the fact that there's real suffering that's being endured by these individuals. And you actually begin with an editorial from the New York Times that I read when it first came out by Andrea Long Chu, who suffers with gender dysphoria and vividly describes the suffering that this transgender woman has been experiencing. So could you elaborate a little bit on that suffering as you've experienced in your own clients or patients over the years?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would have to say that gender dysphoria is extremely rare. And when you look at the DSM-5-TR, the incidence in males is a 0.005 to 0.014, and for females, 0.002. So that's just really, really very few. And now we're seeing, of course, this massive increase in the diagnosis. And so one of the confounds is that gender dysphoria, people that present as gender dysphoria often aren't. It's many other things. We'll talk about that, I imagine, later. But to really have this disorder is truly agonizing because you literally are feeling as though you're a stranger in your own body. And there's this desire to somehow fix that. And of course, the treatments in the pediatric population are very controversial. But a very few, I've had very few, probably less than 5, who I felt were truly gender dysphoric in my career of nearly 40 years. So it's an exceptionally rare disorder, but it's being overdiagnosed. And part of that is because the way we diagnose it, and if you look at the DSM-5 definition of gender dysphoria, it's very broad. It's very easy to fall into that category. But to have the disorder, the true disorder, is truly agonizing. And if you have no one that can help you work through it and understand it, then you're just terribly alone. But it's a sense of just alienation in your own body and not feeling as though it's right.
Well, Dr. Hansen, I have a two-part question for you. First, you mentioned how this is so very rare, so I'm curious as to how you got into the whole issue of dealing with gender dysphoria to the point that you wrote a book, as we've already talked about, and in that book you spend a significant amount of time describing the changes of presentation that have occurred over the past several decades. So first of all, tell us how you got into the topic, and then secondly, can you summarize how these changes have occurred here, especially in the U.S. over the last couple of decades?
I have just, as a pediatric psychologist, I'm a bit sociologist, I have to admit. I like to look at trends, what's happening. And so I noticed maybe 10, 15 years ago that the number one presenting problem had shifted in children to emotion dysregulation. That's always been an issue, but there's been a tremendous uptick in that problem. And so that led me to start exploring what is really going on. And that was the genesis of my first little book. And my books are short because I tend to be kind of simple-minded and I like to keep it really simple. So they're just really a composite of just my notes, my Cliff's notes, so I can understand it. And so I wrote a book on media addiction because I got into the work of Nick Kadaris and Victoria Dunkley, who already were ahead of me on this topic, and found that we're really alienating our children from solid grounding by exposing them to too much media. So my first book was on that issue of what happens to the child, what happens to their brain, what are the consequences, and then what are some of the fixes. And the second book, as I began to explore this, noticed that the progression of media addiction leads to pornography addiction. And we as Christians know that this is a blight in all areas of our society. It affects everyone all the way up. So I wrote a book on that, and then I started looking at, well, what's happening with all this oversexification of children's related to pornography and children presenting with categorically different concerns and almost an obsession about their sexuality. And it's like, hey, there's little concern about getting to know me. These are my pronouns. And so I began to explore what's going on in this. That led me to looking into the whole area of gender dysphoria, which prior to that was gender identity disorder. Because if we go way, way back, we look at the work of Alfred Kinsey and Dr. Harry Benjamin and the early cases of gender dysphoria. But then it just became more and more popular, and there was an explosion of gender identity clinics. And I noticed that far too many children were identifying with sexual confusion issues And so then I wrote my book on transgender, try to understand that. So my book is basically, again, a composite of my Cliff's Notes on what is really going on here. Very alarming problem. And so in many cases, people present as that first, and they have all these comorbidities, but that takes a back seat. And so I want to understand why are we treating this as the fore and not looking at the comorbidities?
Well, Dr. Hansen, someone that we mutually know, and in fact, you and I and Jeff Barrows are all part of, almost seems like a club over these last few years, an email club in which when various articles in all sorts of journals are discovered, that we make each other aware of those on this topic. I've been a part of this for about 5 or 6 years, and I've learned so much through this communication. But Dr. Michael Laidlaw, who heads up the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, is someone whose slides and whose quotes and information you share quite frequently in your book. And this weekend, it just so happens that Dr. Laidlaw shared with both of us an article that's just come out in the Journal of Medical Ethics by Dr. Roberto D'Angelo, and just challenging the secular world to stop attributing classic psychoanalysis to conversion therapy. And a statement that was made in that article that we both received was that psychotherapists working at depth with trans youth often find that gender issues are nested within complicated psychosocial, family, and or developmental issues, or, and this is the key statement, that trans identification is a proxy or carrier for other difficulties. And clearly sexual abuse, sexual trauma in kids is one of those contributing factors. And then gender distress just shows as a result of that. So Dr. D'Angelo from the University of California is saying, stop pushing back against psychoanalysis. So talk to us a little bit about your patients, your clients over the years, and how frequently you see these other factors associated with their gender distress.
Well, first of all, I have to jump back to Dr. Michael Laidlaw, who's become a great friend, a great brother in Christ. So as I was researching, I found a number of his YouTube videos that he had given the Heritage Foundation and elsewhere. And so I go, I've got to meet this guy. And so I discovered that he had a practice in California. So my wife said, well, you need to call Dr. Laidlaw. So I called him, not expecting he would get back to me, and he did. And we got to chatting, and I said, hey, your slides are just awesome. And I was kind of salivating for him. So he graciously shared the content. So I recognized him in the book. And then he introduced me to the great Dr. Andre von Moll, who, as we all know, is a great leader in this area. And then met Dr. Quentin Van Meter. So I feel so fortunate to know you gentlemen and to just have been so nicely introduced to this wonderful group of people that are so bravely stepping up for the rights of our children. So that's my little commercial break. But it's interesting that Mike sent that article out because it caught my eye. Because as clinical psychologists, we're on the front lines of supposedly treating this. And it's just a little bit of a side. We're not treating it. I'm embarrassed for the mental health profession, and I'll speak specifically to clinical psychology, because as PhDs, we're really obliged to know the research that either supports or fails to support our therapeutic treatment modalities. And this is not being done. And good research is being suppressed, as we all know. And anything that doesn't support the agenda is thrown out. And so this whole issue of conversion therapy and being accused of conversion therapy is the terror of many therapists. So you have many that are just not informed and don't know what they're doing. They don't know the research. And there's many that do. I shouldn't say many. There are some that do, but are afraid to step out. So my license is in peril by speaking out. We all have Dr. Jordan Peterson in Canada, who's basically they're ahead of us in this whole agenda, in my opinion. But if we speak out against the trans issue, and again, I'm not against trans people. I'm against the medicalization of children who do not understand informed consent and have no idea of the outcome. So I know I've digressed a little bit and I probably lost sight of the question, but you're asking about the prevalence of
other psychological issues, ACEs in kids, that then this is a marker.
Yeah. So in my book, I do discuss some of them. And of course, this has been my contention. The children I see are presenting as gender dysphoria as though that is the issue that explains what is going on with me. And as providers, I tell my students, I teach at Madigan and elsewhere, but we're salesmen, or I should say salespeople, right? But we're selling an explanation of what's going on with that person. And if we're good at what we do, we know the research, and we sell a narrative that's accurate so that person can begin to get an understanding of what's going on with them. We sell it wrong, we take them down the wrong road. And this whole issue of conversion therapy is linked to that. It's conflating psychotherapy with conversion therapy. And as we really all know, conversion therapy really came out of the horrible treatments for homosexuality that were really barbaric and did not stand up in literature. But getting to your question, there are a number of there's sexual trauma is one big one. Walt Heyer, who most of us know,
yes,
the man, one of the earlier transitions in detransition. I've gotten to know him. We've had many good conversations. States that it's about 50% of people in his experience, and he's had massive experience on his website and elsewhere. So he's really has a good hand on incidence rates. But he proposed it's 50%. 50% of people who are struggling with gender dysphoria have been sexually molested. My contention, I don't deal with the numbers that Walt does, because again, I'm not on a mass website reaching out to all people around the world. But certainly in many of the cases I've had, gender or some form of sexual abuse is big. And we know that sexual abuse and trauma, you can get to the ACE scores, but sexual abuse in particular, that type of trauma and other traumas leave you alienated within your own body. So you have a thing called HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, that gets activated when you've had too much trauma. And that creates all kinds of cascading and neurologic kind of issues, not the least of which is cortisol running all through your body, coursing through every part of you, and it makes you feel like you're literally crawling out of your skin. Or you have a shutdown, the dorsal vagal shutdown. So you can go either way. So in a good world, we're in the green zone. We're connected in that ventral vagus nerve, which is God-given nerve that helps settle all organs in our body. It also helps us stay socially connected. But when we're in defense, and we need to be able to go to defense, it's just we don't want to stay in defense. So people in trauma, early trauma, developmental trauma, or shock, in this case, sexual abuse, will become activated either in HPA or shutdown, or they'll alternate back and forth, and they can't find neurologic safety. So that's tantamount to just not feeling anything. So people will self-injure and cut because they don't feel anything. They cut because they want to feel something. Or if they're too activated, they'll cut because they want to quell the system and bathe it in endorphins. It's basically a defense system gone awry. So these children or adolescents are struggling to find the story of what is causing this, because it's horrible. And so then you go to TikTok, it's gender dysphoria. That's your real issue. So they're jumping on to this activist-led thing as an explanation, a desperate hope that this will somehow be the answer. And if I can just change my body, that's going to make me be okay. So that's why we're seeing so much detransition. And I'm not saying there aren't some people that are trans. I think there are. I don't rant against trans people. What I do is I rail against the adults in the room that are pushing this on our children for various reasons.
And if I remember correctly, that Walt Heyer points out that he spends most of his time, unfortunately, it's way too late in their lives, but walking through those adverse childhood experiences and counseling through it. And so many have breakthroughs like, why couldn't I have had this earlier in my life? And Walt had the same experience himself.
The advocates of this will say that when you look at this evolution of the sock, or I should say the devolution of the sock, sock 1 through what do we have, 8 now? It started off was never really okay, but it started off, you have to have letters and this, that, and the other. You don't have to have anything now.
And for our listeners, that's standards of care coming out from WPATH, correct?
And it's really not standards of care, is it? Because it's not scientifically based. It's really guidelines.
Yeah. It's
secular guidelines and a way of treating this, but it's really gone off the rails. And many of the people that are members of WPATH, which puts out SOC, have left. Some of the liberals have left because they realize that this is just crazy. But so these poor people think that this is going to answer their problems, and it doesn't. And they're not getting adequate screening, psychological evaluations, because people like me are living in terror that I don't live in terror. I just put it in God's hands. But if I lose my license, I lose my license. I'll fight to keep it. But if that's where it goes, that's where it goes. But people are afraid to step up. And I think we Christians need to step up. That's why I love what you gentlemen are doing. And others like Mike, Layla, and Andre, and Quentin, and many others are stepping up at the risk of a certain amount of possible harm to their careers.
That's why I'm so thankful for the SCGM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. It's a terrific organization. But Dr. Hansen, you briefly mentioned TikTok, and I want to delve into that a little bit more because I'm sure that with your long clinical experience counseling both children and adolescents, you have to deal quite often with the issue of social media. So I'm curious as to what do you do to advise kids struggling with various issues as well as their parents, specifically when it comes to these gender issues and their interaction with social media?
Well, of course, again, as I said earlier, that's a great question. What led me to this was looking at media and electronic media addiction because I saw all the issues. And one of the biggest is lack of connection. So our children need, in order to be healthy, being connected with the outside world, but very important, we need to be connected with others. We need to be connected with our parents. And so media is, in essence, taken children away and adolescents away from connecting to all good things. Yuan Hari, who's not a Christian, one of my favorite writers on depression, he talks about 8 points of disconnection that lead to problems in living, and in particular depression, which is one of the driving forces, depression and anxiety, driving force for wanting to transition. But TikTok is probably the worst because it teaches kids and adolescents all that they need to say, I'm suicidal. If I don't do this, I'm going to kill myself. And pushes them, if your parents aren't with you, they're against you. And so it's very divisive. This is very dangerous. So if you're working with this population, you need to also be working with the families. So one of the things that I do, and maybe it's a bit different than some of my colleagues, even when I'm working with teens, I'll certainly meet with them individually, of course, but I'll want to treat them also. I treat them individually, but also within the system of the family. So you're not going to get a teen to back off of media without parental help and involvement. This is not going to happen.
Right.
It's just the pull is just way too hard.
And when you say connection, are you saying interpersonal connection versus the virtual connection? Is that right?
Yeah. So connecting with media is fine to a point, but it comes at a price. So children growing up developmentally are very different now than they were maybe in my generation. Their brains look different as well. So when you don't have ongoing connection early on, attachment, I'm a big advocate of looking at attachment and what happens to the brain. Alan Shore's work on attachment is amazing. What happens to the brain when you don't have that early attachment? So you already then have a different brain if you start off with poor attachment. And then you add insult to injury by putting a little kid on an iPad at age 3 or 4 as a babysitter. Now you're creating a form of emotion dysregulation of the brain because you need to have internal mechanisms to self-soothe. They'll go to media to self-soothe. Jonathan Haidt talks about that beautifully. The importance of having connection, and Alan Shore as well, to learn that capacity to self-soothe. And everyone's going, when they need a struggle, teens will go to media first. They won't go to a peer. They won't go to their parents. They'll go to media, social media, TikTok, etc., to try to find that connection piece. But your iPad won't say, honey, I love you. You're going to get through this. You're going to be okay. And we know that neurology starves for interpersonal connection. So our young people aren't having this. So they're patently unhealthy, and then you feed a crazy ideology on them. They have no fighting chance. I'm really, really concerned. I've never seen, and lots been written about us, we're aware of this. I've never seen more suicidal cases, more self-injury, horrific problems than I have in our youth today. I used to hospitalize a child maybe once every 4 or 5 months. And I've had weeks in my hospital where I'm hospitalizing 2 or 3 a week. And so it's not just one thing, it's all these social forces that are wreaking havoc on our children.
And our U.S. Surgeon General recently published a report on that. And while I haven't had a chance to take too deep of a dive, it's clear, and I've heard it discussed on other podcasts in the last few months, that everyone is understanding the danger of social media. Dr. Hansen, several years ago, some of the experts that we have been going to get feedback, folks on the podcast, have been saying that there's a significant crack, and it seems like now multiple cracks in the foundation of this transgender tsunami. Maybe that began with the Tavistock and Kiara Bell lawsuit and all of that. And now just read an article in the Free Press about Dr. Kaltiala, adolescent psychiatrist from Finland, who's actually in our country, giving testimony in the lawsuit against the American Academy of Pediatrics.
I saw that. That is wonderful.
Just an amazing article, and I'm trying to get Dr. Kaltiala to join us on CMDA Matters because I'd like to hear her testimony. I want listeners to hear from those who are, like you were talking about, Canada being ahead of us, so to speak, but certainly Finland is way ahead of us.
I would qualify Canada's ahead of us in a bad way.
Yeah, yes.
They're going the wrong way, and they're pushing this ideology way more, equally bad. They're just like Jordan Peterson that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Well, in the show notes today, we will have a reference to this article by Dr. Kaltiala that just was in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, I read that. It's great.
And gender-affirming care is dangerous. I know because I helped pioneer it. This is one of 2 leading adolescent psychiatrists in Finland. And my country and others found there is no solid evidence supporting the medical transitioning of young people. Why aren't American clinicians paying attention? And Dr. Barrows and I have repeatedly said on this program that our listeners, our members, and in their systems, their networks, they need to be speaking up. Now, it requires courage. So I just want to hear from you, Dr. Hansen. You're obviously courageous. You said you know that where you practice there in Arizona, your license is on the line every single day for willing to do change-allowing counseling and therapy with your clients. Talk to our listeners about how important it is, especially right now with so much damaging literature coming out, not from people of faith, but from people who represent national healthcare institutions. What can our listeners do to get more involved and to disrupt the status quo and the tsunami that we've experienced?
Charlie Kirk, you know Charlie Kirk?
Yes.
He is awesome. So he came out and spoke at actually Prescott. And the Prescott women of, what do they call them? The women of Prescott, Republican women of Prescott, that's what they call themselves. They sponsored it. And he fills a room. He's amazing. But he talked about, in general terms, what's going on ideologically in our country, with the trans movement being one subset. The whole trans movement is nothing but a pawn in the overall scheme. When you look at the whole train of Marxism, and not to get too conspiracy theorist, but it's true. So we have classical Marxism, right? Marx and all that, and Engels. And then you have the neo-Marxists, the Frankfurt School. And then you have the Gramsci's, the Koch's that looked at why didn't the economic aspect of Marxism work? And it's because you have to go to a different level, which is the social cultural aspect. So it's been described as a march to the institutions, Derek Bell in the legal system, critical race, then the queer theory, Judith Butler, Foucault. Foucault was brilliant. He was just a morally bankrupt human being. And pushed queer through, which basically anything normative is bad, anything normative. So now they call me cisgender, like I got to be labeled. And so you want to push anything that's radical or different. So this is in our schools, this is in our politics, in our institutions. We're losing rapidly the First Amendment. And certainly the First Amendment in medicine and psychology is out the window. It doesn't exist the way it should. So if you write something, it's pulled. Mike Laidlaw, I talked to him last night or 2 nights ago, and he put out a little review on Amazon, my book. And he said, buy this book soon because it's probably going to be banned. This is probably going to happen. So what Charlie Kirk says, we have to get involved on multiple levels. So you put out a little book that might get shot down or not, or you'd write amicus briefs. I've written 3 or 4 of them. I actually co-written. I had a small part of them. So those are on the higher level, in the legal cases, right? But then there's the grassroots level. So the Republican Women of Prescott approached me and said, yeah, we know you wrote a book. Would you be willing to start meeting with us? So we're meeting now with the mayor and the sheriff. And our movement right now, I just wrote a position paper on the perils of bringing in pornography in our school libraries. And I looked through the books that are in the libraries, you would not believe it. I mean, pornography, pure and simple. And any child can check them out. So we have to be careful because you get accused of free speech and banning books. So we're saying, okay, librarian, if you're going to let Freddie have this book, at least ask the parents. Bring the parents in the loop. Of course, this movement wants to separate children from parents and decrease parent influence. So I'm taking the time to meet with these wonderful people and meet with the mayor and meet with the sheriff to start implementing policies. We're sending out a letter to all the libraries real soon that's going to ask the librarians to do this. So we must stand up. As Christians, we must stand up. And people will say, well, my vote doesn't matter, or getting involved in the school board or speaking out in the community doesn't matter. It does. It's one person at a time. And I would encourage we Christians to be much more voiced, much braver to speak out. And we want to be civil. We want to be respectful, of course. But sometimes we take that to an extreme, too nice. Mm-hmm. Christians need to learn how to fight and be mighty warriors, in my opinion. And we're losing our children. We're losing them. We're close to having lost them. This whole generation, as I said earlier, never before have I seen a more troubled youth population and a more connected in media but disconnected in life. They're not living life, and they're not happy. And they'll tell you they're not happy. When you ask them, are you happy? I'm working with a young lady now. She knows she's miserable. She wants out. She just doesn't know how. Yeah. And the parents themselves are so, I know I kind of ranty about media, but they're so into their own media, they're not paying attention.
Well, parents only need to look to the state of Virginia to see that they can have a true impact there and what's still ongoing. So, and I also think that the transgender ideologues really don't know yet what to do with parents' rights because they're going to hit and have hit a very strong wall. But making a shift a little bit, Dr. Hansen, you mentioned Walt Heyer briefly and just were kind of alluding to detransitioners. I'm curious as to your experience with detransitioners in your practice, and have you had any experience in counseling them and some of the struggles they deal with as they come out of their gender transition?
I have not actively worked with many active detransitioners. I've worked with many desisters. So at my level is more of the desisters that, as I tell them, listen, I'm not here to talk you out of transitioning. I'm not here to talk you out of your gender dysphoria. And good therapy wouldn't do that.
Well, differentiate for our listeners the difference between detransitioner and desisters.
Okay, so the detransitioner is a person who's gone through some of the changes, whether it's hormone therapy, whatever, or even surgery. Walt Heyer went pretty far with it. He detransitioned, so he tried to claim as much of his male sexuality back as possible. So that's a rough road because you can't get it back. You can't get it back. And so we lie to our children, we lie by admission. If you've had puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, you're infertile forever. Yeah. You also probably never going to have an orgasm. And one of the questions I haven't asked, but I want to ask an adult group assembly, say, listen, how about if I asked you to never have an orgasm for the rest of your life? That's what we're asking our children. If we push this to the end.
And in your book, Dr. Hansen, as well as this article that we got over the weekend, some of the evidence is that up to a third of the kids who were on puberty blockers and then hormones have stopped taking them. So this whole thing that it's extremely rare.
It's not extremely rare. And I find this, gentlemen, that if you just say, listen, why don't we just explore what's going on in your life? And let's look at what else is going on in your life. I've had children, one guy that almost killed his father in a fight, and then his stash of antidepressants to kill himself if he didn't get what he wanted, or he had a stash of money to run away. This person wanted to transition. said, okay, let's just put that aside a little bit. And let's just deal with your comorbidities. Let's get things settled in the family. He was estranged from his father, horrible relationship. He was absolutely miserable. And so we just dealt with his depression. I had to hospitalize him for several months, but I worked in therapy as he was in the hospital with the parents, videoing them in. And he now is on his way. He's in university now and thinking about going into medicine. But we just dealt with his comorbidities. And one by one, the pieces of his life came back together. Got back into his studies, got back into academics, doing well, rocking it, got back with his group of friends and his music. He has agreed to wait until he's 25. And his dad said, hey, doc, when does the brain stop growing? And we're all aware that he's about 25, 27. Mine's probably still working, but we have all this massive change in the brain, right? Now, the limbic system wires in first. There's a lot of myelination and development of the brain from age 12, 13, all the way to 25. The limbic system wires in first. The prefrontal cortex wires in second. That's the braking system. So if you have trauma or whatever in these children during adolescence, sometimes you'll have the accelerated, the limbic system. Let's do it. Wire in first, and then development stops. Now you have all accelerator and no brakes. But if you allow the brain and you stay free of massive trauma and develop normally, you get the wonderful braking system comes in later. So this is where we get into the UK talking about decision-making, informed consent. Young teens who want to do it, right? It's all accelerator. Give them time to let the braking system come into play so they can start evaluating, does this really make sense? So we want to allow our young people time to make these decisions. So I will deal with comorbidities, and this gentleman has agreed to wait till he's 25. We'll see what he does at 25. He desisted for now. So sometimes the best I can do is we desist for now. We defer it. I never try to talk him out of it. That could be construed as conversion. And so as we explore the comorbidities, that HB activation I talked about settles, or the dorsal vagal shutdown, they start coming online, and they get into that green zone of connection with the ventral vagus nerve. Now they start experiencing life in its richness, which is what this young gentleman was doing. He was lit up like absolute, you could see joy in his face come back. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what he'll do when he's 25. I suspect he probably won't, but I don't know. But at least he's gotten through his adolescence. And so for, an adolescent's neurology, young adult's neurology, you need to have your normal hormone baths, right? Estrogen for females, testosterone for males. And when we don't have those normal hormone baths, the body goes awry. It's not good. So I'm in favor of allowing a child to settle their comorbidities, explore what might be driving this. And in most all cases, I see family dynamics as playing a massive role of what's driving this. One young lady, one of my first trans cases way back 25 years ago, and she is in my book. She's kind of been camouflaged in, but she gave me permission to talk about her openly. But she had a very, very problematic relationship with her mother, was super toxically anxious. And she adored her father. She had done away with her father, couldn't fathom being a female, and couldn't fathom having children. I'm happy to say that she worked through it. She went suicidal at one point, was self-injuring at one point, but beautifully worked through it now as a child, happily married. So deferring for her, and she was a Christian, by the way, so she was in neurological hell and absolutely miserable. But as she dealt with her comorbidities and came to understand that she couldn't identify with being a female because of her mother's toxic anxiety, once she resolved that and worked on her own anxiety, she could embrace her femininity.
Well, Dr. Hansen, some of the literature from 30 or 40 years ago dealing with gender dysphoria as it used to be understood with its true incidence, desistance rates of somewhere between 80 and 95% or something like that. Would you agree? I'm coming to you from a non-mental health care professional perspective to ask this question, but it seems that if the kind of counseling and therapy that you give is not even related to that old form, the way it used to be dealt with, would it not seem sensical that the desistance rate would even be higher in what we're facing today, the gender distress that we're seeing today.
Oh, absolutely. Miriam Grossman, a book, it was just a one-pager. I wish she developed it. And her books, by the way, commercial break, her book is one of the best. It's an amazing book.
Lost in Transnation, I think is the title.
And a ton of advice. She covers the history, but a ton of advice for parents what to do, how to navigate through this with your teen, how to navigate with the school. It is absolutely a goldmine. So a plug for her. It's the best book. It's just wonderful. But remind me of the question. I lost it.
Just will not desistance rates be even higher than those classic papers?
So in her book, she talked about, I think it's age 3 or 4, we go through a sense of gender identity. Boys and girls need to discover their sex. Oh, I'm a boy. Oh, I'm a girl. I got this thing. You got that thing. Show me yours. I'll show you mine. Right? Kids do that. Kids have that natural curiosity. And then at maybe 5 or so, they have a sense of gender consistency. So it's gender identity, gender consistency. And then around maybe 7, 8, gender permanence. So gender consistency, I'm a boy. I guess I'll grow up to be a man. And later on, I guess I can't change this. Now that's a fundamental rooting in reality that kids need, hard reality. We need to let children go through this natural phase. And when you start putting in, well, you can be in kindergarten, 3 or 4, a boy, a girl, a zebra, a donkey, whatever, you're creating anxiety. And anxiety is something children know and need to explore. You're taking that away from them. When you transition them and push it, because the only answer now in the schools, and even in American Academy of Pediatrics, which I'm highly critical of, is to affirm, affirm, affirm. Now, most of us, I remember when I was 4, my twin brother and I discovered my mom's high heels. And we loved playing on high heels. And a psychologist today, I think you need to transition these young boys. So I read so much. But, once I discovered that I was getting broken ankles from the high heels, I go, this is stupid. I'm done. But it was a natural explorative thing, right? I didn't want to be, nor did my twin brother. We just were exploring, right? We discovered different clothes, this, that, and the other. And we were dressing up, and it was fun. And then we're done. A couple of weeks later, we're done with it. So if you just let people alone, they'll go through these phases. They'll explore who they are. They'll discover their gender identity, their gender consistency, and their gender permanence. But when you give them, and I talked earlier about giving people a narrative, right? Selling the wrong narrative, they'll buy that. And then all of a sudden they're getting lots of attention. And keep in mind that children tend to not be as connected as the parents and with their parents as they used to be or as they could be. So now they're just fodder to be influenced. And once you get them on that train, they don't get off. Mm-hmm. If you leave them alone, they let go. Now, some of these children will end up being gay. And, we can struggle with the whole issue of gay in another conversation, homosexuality, but a homosexual person at least is not demolishing the body in a way that they can never get it back or doing things to their body that can kill them.
It seems to me, Dr. Hansen, that the next frontier for those in the category of the email club that I was talking about earlier to deal with is how to counsel those who are wanting to detransition, because there's not much out there. The other side is refusing to acknowledge that it almost never happens. So are there resources out there for the future as we see these third that we talked about that are leaving taking puberty blockers and are desisting? Are there adequate resources out there right now to help folks like yourself and other professionals?
Sasha Ayad is a name you need to know. She doesn't take a position on faith. She wrote with Stella O'Malley and a few others a wonderful book that deals with how to help people out of this. Gen Spec Matters is, I think, one of the websites. Stella O'Malley is in Ireland. Sasha is in the US. And they do a wonderful podcast. And all the big names they've interviewed, they're amazing. So she put a clinical guidelines. It's on my website. Clinical guidelines for treatment. It is an amazing document.
Wow, thank you for that resource.
I just got her book, and I forgot to bring it in, but her book, and it's co-written by Stella O'Malley and a third woman who's also remarkable, I just can't recall her name, that is on par with Marion Grossman's book. Mm-hmm. It is secular, but research-wise, very, very accurate. Yeah. And these are amazing women. And that document, which is on my website for therapy or treatment guidelines, I think it's treatment guidelines for gender issues. It's an amazing document, not unlike Marion Grossman's book, but gets a little bit more into detail in the psychotherapy aspect with just a lot of guidelines for what therapists can do. And so I would refer the interested parent or therapist to that document. It's excellent.
Well, I don't know how many of our listeners are Christians in healthcare who follow Christ have a statement of faith in their clinical work, but you do. And yours, as I close, says, life is full of unlimited opportunities and joys if we choose to live in connected harmony with our Creator and with one another and our beautiful world. My heartfelt commitment is to help others find this balance using biblical perspective, evidence, and neuroscience-based psychotherapy. So for a mental health professional, sounds like a great statement of faith. And Dr. Hansen, thanks for joining us today, Dr. Barrows and myself on CMDA Matters, and having a very important conversation with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been absolutely delightful. And my prayers for you, CMA, as you continue your podcast and your important mission, because you gentlemen are getting the word out. And that's really remarkable. So thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you as well for standing up in the process of putting out this book. That takes a lot of courage in today's world.
It sure does. God bless you, Dr. Hansen.
Blessings to you, gentlemen.
Have you visited the CMDA Bookstore recently? We've made some changes over the last few months, and we're excited for you to start shopping again. All of CMDA's resources that we've published, plus a whole host of medically reliable and biblically sound materials, are now available for you through our partnership with ChristianBook.com. There you can find books like Leadership Proverbs by Dr. David Stevens and Pastor Burt Jones, or Whispers by Dr. Al Weir. Visit cmda.org/bookstore to purchase books like these and many more.
I am incredibly thankful for people like Dr. Jeff Hansen and others that we've interviewed on the podcast that we mentioned today, like Dr. Andre Van Mol and Dr. Miriam Grossman. People who are willing to take a stand and speak out on this topic. You heard Jeff mention that this podcast and the message that we have, our guests, it's important to get the word out. Would you share this interview with others in your environs? That's the way for this word, for truth, from those who are on the ground taking care of these patients, these clients, can get out, is if you'll share with others and they can share with others. If you'd like to read Dr. Hansen's new book, you can find it on Amazon, and we've also included a link in our show notes today. During our conversation, Dr. Hansen mentioned a few other resources, such as a book from Dr. Grossman. He mentioned a couple of journal articles and his website. You'll find these links to those resources in our show notes as well today. I would also like to encourage you to regularly check out CMDA's blog that we call The Point. It's a great place to find perspectives and opinions on today's issues and news topics. Our regular contributors cover a wide variety of subjects, including this transgender issue, so it's a highly valuable resource for you, friends. To find the blog, just visit cmda.org/thepoint.
Join us on Saturday, February 3rd at 10 a.m. Eastern Time for the Convergence, Critical Conversations for Healthcare and Theology. This is a virtual webinar hosted by CMDA and the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Darrell Bach, Dr. Jeff Barrows, and Nicole Hayes will help you sort through the polarization we see in today's political landscape. as well as the 2 kinds of evangelicalism in the public square. You can learn more and register at cmda.org/events.
Well, if you're looking for more information to be prepared for conversations with colleagues or your friends about the transgender issue, I've got a couple of recommendations for you. First is our CMDA Learning Center, where you can find a handful of courses available for continuing education credit that discuss the transgender topic. For example, you can find recordings from a conference that we hosted with the Hendricks Center that Jamie was talking about earlier at Dallas Theological Seminary, entitled Critical Conversations on Identity and Gender. Plus, you can find other webinars that discuss the misnamed conversion therapy, the biblical, theological, and clinical perspectives of the transgender movement, and several others. You know, another new accredited set of courses on the Learning Center involves a comprehensive series of talks on opioid use disorder. This course is aimed at Christians who want to provide excellent care in the midst of the current opioid epidemic. All of these courses are free to our CMDA members. You can find these courses and more in the CMDA Learning Center at cmda.org/learning. Second is a free small group study that we have produced called Bridging the Gap, where medical science and the church meet. This study was developed by expert healthcare professionals, and it's designed to arm you with the knowledge to speak truth into ethical issues and courageously stand up for what's morally right according to our beliefs that are based upon God's Word. The curriculum is designed to ask actually difficult and thought-provoking questions as we seek the truth found in Scripture about the ethical issues facing Christians today. Topics include addictions, beginning of life and end of life, gender identity, right of conscience, as well as sexuality. If you'd like more information and to download this free curriculum, just visit cmda.org/bridgingthegap. Well, as I bring us to a close, next week's episode will involve an interview with Dr. Ralph Alvarado. He's a physician whose career and calling brought him into public service. And he now finds himself serving as the commissioner of Tennessee's Department of Health. As always, friends, if you'd like to suggest a future guest for us to bring onto the program, you can email us at cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like our podcast, please be sure here in the early part of 2024 to give us a 5-star rating and share us on your favorite social media platform. To close, I want to highlight this comment that we received from a CMDA student member who attended one of our CMDA conferences this past fall. The student said, "It was incredibly refreshing to meet other Christian healthcare professionals who are called into medicine and who do what they do to serve and glorify the Lord. In a career filled with self-worth and pursuit of worldly success, finding others who think like me was incredibly encouraging and gave me motivation and hope for the rest of my school years." Statements like this remind us all about the importance of the work that God has called us to do here at CMDA. It's the reason we continue to ask for your support with our giving campaigns each December and June. And it's the reason that we continue providing weekly podcasts that deal with the critical issues like transgenderism. It's also the reason we continue to host conferences or create resources and so much more. And through CMDA members and champions like you or near you, we will be bringing the hope and healing of Jesus Christ to our world in 2024. That's what matters to CMDA, and CMDA matters. We'll see you next week, friends, God willing.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.